thought I would give you something a little different today, so talking about all the quirky episodes here. Southern Arizona is a very, very weird place. You probably know that. If you drive through Tucson, you will certainly confirm it, okay? I'd probably argue that the Santa Cruz River is what pours all that weirdness up north. The region and the valley are both historically and geographically really just strange. The Santa Cruz itself starts in Arizona, runs into Mexico, and then comes back up again. The river crosses the border twice, and that sets up a plethora of complications regarding water usage, trash coming north, and making it real hard for us to save the beautiful river in the United States. Of course, as I'm sure you know, the San Pedro and the Santa Cruz both flow north through Arizona. A fact that we accept intellectually, but it's still always really hard to fathom, saying it's going downriver when you mean going north. So, the Santa Cruz ribbon of riparian woodland is almost unbelievable in that it supports the greatest diversity of mammal species in North America and contains over 20 rare bird species and endangered species, second only to a tropical rainforest. That sliver of the valley south of Tucson also contains hundreds of stories, native trade routes, mining booms, expeditions to found new cities, and of course, lots of stories of daring and danger, murder and disease, and sometimes some very, very ludicrous happenings. Tumacácori Historical Park, where I work, is 3 miles south of Tubac, Arizona. It is the only national park with 2 birthdays. Tumacácori became a national monument in 1908 under Teddy Roosevelt, and almost immediately it gets caught up in a dispute over an old Spanish land grant known as Baca Float Number 3. This land grant goes from the south of Tubac to Nogales, Arizona. Now, the story's way too complicated for this talk. We'd take a day and a half, but suffice it to say that it's a dispute over a land grant that spent decades in U.S. courts and involved at first the heirs and finally the land speculators. Of course, not surprisingly, the moneyed interest won out and the poor people on the land who had legal homesteads lost. When the case was settled in 1914, the land where the national monument was returned to the government. By 1917, Tumacácori was a national monument yet again. No one celebrated that second anniversary, that second birthday. The Comptroller of the United States basically said, nothing to see here, move along. The homesteaded settlers had absolutely nothing to celebrate. In fact, what happened to them was a series of horrific episodes. The incident affected mostly the Mexican-American community, though a few whites were caught up in the wrath of the new landowners in the guise of federal marshals. Between 1917 and 1925, family after family were evicted from their homes they had worked to build into farms and ranches, again, legally. Now, usually these evictions came in the dark of night, like around midnight. Even the Tubac school teacher, a white woman named Sarah Black, had everything in her house emptied onto the lawn because she did not evict herself fast enough. Another woman, a Mexican woman, her house was slightly outside the boundary, but she had cows grazing in the boundary. The marshal showed up and said, get your cows off the property. Well, she said, I'll have to find a cowboy to do that, but I'll take care of it. And they said, oh, don't worry, we'll solve the problem. They shot all 10 of her cows to death. Even more unjust and harsh treatment was meted out. One farmer snuck back onto his land after the eviction to gather some of his vegetables for his family. He was arrested. They tossed him in the Nogales jail, and some inhuman guards were working, fed him his vegetables, but they laced them with rat poisoning. He lost his mind and ended up in the state mental hospital where he died. Now, another individual went to draw water from an irrigation canal to which he had rights on certain days. 2 cowboys working for the new landowners threatened to shoot him if he got off his horse and messed with the canal. He did. He stepped off the horse, opened the head gate, climbed back on his horse, and they shot him in the back. He managed to make it back to his home where he died in the arms of his wife. The 2 cowboys, by the way, that shot him were exonerated by a jury. Those tragedies today are really still fresh in the minds of the Mexican-American community around Tubac. And all the new people moving into Arizona by the hundreds every month are totally unaware of this. So they remain blissfully unaware. In 1921, Congress passed the Relief of Settlers Act. Sounds like a good thing, except the land was mostly of poorer quality, and all of these people who had grown up here in southern Arizona had to go to Buckeye, Arizona. Now, I imagine they'd all be rich right now if they had stayed, but whatever. Those homesteaders that fought the system lost to the person. And some of those, the interesting thing is, some of those homesteads have never legally been invalidated. That would be an interesting court case. Now, the Tumacácori Mission itself had some pretty strange episodes of danger and death over its 157-year history. There are, of course, a number of deaths due to disease. Some estimates put the death toll among the native peoples at about 40% this far north. Death by disease is always there, and sadness is a constant companion for everybody in the mission system. Even the priests felt it. Several of the priests that worked at Tumacácori actually were sent away from the frontier because they were suffering from what we term as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had watched so many of their flock die, it had just broken them. Sometimes there's stories about them from the mission that make us laugh. One of my favorites involves a Franciscan father named Joseph Ramirez. Father Ramirez was a rarity among the missionaries. He was actually born in Mexico. A sickly man, he was stationed at San Javier, but occasionally he would fill in down at Tumacácori. On September 26, 1805, after a whole month fighting a fever, he died. That night, his body lay in the church, lit by candles. Then, in the early evening, the fathers that attended him saw a sign from heaven. Father Ramirez's face began to glisten with sweat. His skin went from gray to pink. The attending priest conferred and decided they would not bury him because there was a miracle going on here. Would Father Ramirez rise from the dead? Well, as the sun rose, the pallor of death returned, and Father Ramirez was laid to rest. There are other humorous stories as well. They don't necessarily deal with danger or death, but they do speak to our common humanity with people from the past. Father Agustin de Campos was the priest that took over after Father Kino died. He had the whole frontier to worry about. Father Campos had a rough start among the Atum. They didn't really care for him, and he was doing the my way or the highway stuff. But slowly he began to respect them, and they began to like and respect him. He got tired of people in Mexico City sending him notes on how to run everything because they had no idea of what the reality was on the frontier. He wrote some intemperate letters to the priest in charge, the bishops and everything, and he got called on the carpet in Mexico. This man rode down to Mexico City, got his butt chewed out, turned around and rode back with no break. He rode 3,000 miles. Father Campos never got on a horse again because he had hemorrhoids so bad that he could not do it. I'm serious. While disease and hemorrhoids plagued the missions more than you know, the natives and priests feared only one thing: Apaches. Everyone fears Apaches to extreme disease. Now, mind you, 75% of you are going to die by disease. But of course, we're going to worry about Apaches. All right? The reality is that the Apaches only made direct attacks on the mission compound 3 times in the whole recorded history. Raiding Apaches did not seek conflict, they're seeking livestock. Occasionally a herder would be out there alone and get himself killed in a raid, but even that's pretty rare. The 3 instances of assaults on the mission were in 1773, 1801, and 1848. The 1773 attack against the mission compound seems the Apaches simply holding the people inside at bay while they are, and stopping anyone from impeding their ability to steal all the horses and cows. After that raid, the priest reported that only 2 breeding mares were left, and one of those was lanced. There were 8 horses left. Horses are not considered breeding mares, and they were all lame. They couldn't run away. And the priest reported that out of the more than 2,000 cattle at the mission, he only had 46 left. Now, the last attack was in December of 1848. The physical effect of that attack was not recorded. It was pretty minimum, but it had a profound effect. Tumacácori mission was abandoned and would sit idle until Roosevelt made it a national monument in 1908. It was the 1801 attack that was the most real for everybody. It could almost be considered a siege. The O'odham defended the walls of the mission for 2 whole days. On a hot Friday, June 5th, a 15-year-old boy was the first to be caught outside the wall and killed. 2 other men died near him. The resident priest, Father Gutierrez, reported there was no way to get to them because the Apaches were lying in wait for the people to come outside. The bodies laid there until the evening of the 6th, the next day. Now, in theory, a galloping rescue party of soldiers from the Tubac Presidio could make it to the mission in less than 20 minutes. But all through the night of the 5th, nobody came. It turned out, as was typical, most of the soldiers were somewhere on detached duty. Finally, later in the afternoon of Saturday, the soldiers at Tubac managed to gather enough civilian help and rode to the rescue. Well, the Apaches retreated with the livestock in tow, except for sheep. Sheep just don't herd as fast as cattle and horses. So during this siege, the Apaches slaughtered 1,360 sheep. Now, of course, on the frontier, nothing goes to waste. Inspection reports in 1804 would actually report that Tumacácori and Tubac had a homegrown blanket and serge industry. So they were actually making all the wool with, or making all the products with the wool that was left. Whether they skinned the sheep in the middle of the summer or whether they actually sheared the dead sheep, we do not know. It's worth noting that Tumacácori should have had a permanent guard of 4 soldiers and a sergeant. The reality was, though, that the fort never had enough soldiers to go around, and the other reality is that the priests and officers of the Presidio constantly were fighting each other, and so the officer could hold back those guards that should have been there. There's even quarters at Tumacácori for that purpose. Now, in the American period, opportunity comes to Tubac in the Valley in the 1850s. The California gold rush proved less than fruitful for most, and some of the thousands of travelers that passed down the Santa Cruz River en route to the gold fields remembered the landscape and envisioned the possibility of mining here. They remembered that the narrowest part of the Santa Cruz Valley was at Tubac, framed by tall mountains, and it looked to have great mineral potential. The official Americans arrived in 1856 under the guise of the 1st Dragoons, but Tubac and the Valley were already really Americans. Tubac still had a Mexican military outpost, but the community had been taken over by the American Mining Company, and so it was American. As of August of 1856, that mining company was digging and blasting under the supervision or rule of a 31-year-old man, Charles Poston. Charles Poston would become known as the father of Arizona. At Tubac, he is famously quoted for saying, "We had no law but love, and no occupation but labor." Love was the last thing on the minds of the citizens of the Santa Cruz Valley at this time, and labor definitely includes robbery. The mining boom that came to the Santa Cruz Valley just before the Civil War brought death and destruction from all sides. With silver and gold in their dreams, and the divided union that's about to happen doesn't loom large in the daily lives of the citizens and miners of Tubac. But the coming succession did cause one of the most famous duels in Arizona history. Southern sympathizer and mine operator Sylvester Mowry, on your left, and Edward Cross, a dedicated Union man and editor of Arizona's first newspaper, were squabbling. Cross publicly and in print disparaged Mowry's character. Mowry was both a supporter of slavery and secession. He was also a promoter of Arizona to the point of extreme exaggeration, which irritated Cross. Cross did not see Arizona as the land of plenty, and that, along with his opposition to slavery, finally brought the two men into a gunfight on July 8th, 1859. Now, the duel was fought with brand new Burnside rifles at 40 paces apart. 4 shots were fired before the duel ended. Both men fired 3 shots, and then Edward Cross fired a 4th. He missed Mowry. At the same time, Mowry went to fire, but the cap didn't go off on his gun. Mowry declared his honor was satisfied. The citizens of Tubac, as always, celebrated with a hogshead of whiskey. Now, the day after the duel, the Weekly Arizona reported that the winds had caused the antagonists to meet each other. If you've ever been here on July 8th, there is no wind. It is hot and humid and gross, okay? And for goodness sakes, these two guys had the latest in technology with these carbines, and they still missed each other. It kind of tells you they weren't really intending to do anything. The newspaper claimed the men made up and became friends. The truth says otherwise. Right after the duel, Edward Cross resigned as editor of the newspaper, and Mowry, in a little bit of irony, bought the newspaper, moved it to Tucson, and began to print his political views. The printing press, by the way, which caused the duel, which now resides in the museum at Tubac, even had a quirky or interesting journey. It moved to Tucson in 1862, it moved to Tucson, and then in 1862, the general in charge of Union forces came in, learned it had been printing Confederate sympathizing newspapers and stuff, had it tossed into the Santa Cruz River. Well, obviously that wasn't going to last, so it was retrieved and began printing Union sympathetic documents. It ended up in Tombstone for years and was retrieved from a leaky building down here, and then finally found its new home in the state park at Tubac. As for Edward Cross and Sylvester Mowry, well, Cross died leading a charge at Gettysburg, dying bravely. Mowry lingered a bit longer, living until 1871 and dying of kidney disease in London, England. Now, really, little of the excitement and what occurred in the Santa Cruz Valley had little to do with the Civil War and was much more about the number of scallywags and road pirates in the area. Tubac probably and fairly should have earned the nickname Town Too Tough to Die, not Tombstone. Tombstone's got 45-second fight. Tubac has so many more murders and shootouts than Tombstone. It's not funny. They almost all involve heavy drinking. December 26, 1858, the newspaper reports, Anton Eisner and John Street were drunk, and the former shot the latter without provocation. That's December 26th, the day after Christmas. Jesus. So another gunfight takes place coming out of the front door of one of the saloons, of which there were many. The first man comes out the door, and a second man follows him. He turns and tries to draw his gun and shoot, but he's so drunk he can't even shoot straight. The second guy simply pulls his revolver out and fires at man number one. Shoots him through the backbone, pierces his heart and comes out through the front. Well, man number one runs down the street and falls into the arms of his prostitute girlfriend. Showing how common that all these killings were at this time, the person reporting to the newspaper simply said, I went ahead and left, but it did not look good, okay? Two of the lesser known stories about the murder in the valley are about brothers. Charles Poston, the father of Arizona, who wrote about that love and labor in the Tubac area, had a brother named John. No photograph of John Poston, okay? John was susceptible to the dreams and the salesmanship of his brother, came to Arizona to get rich too. He ended up being the superintendent of the Heinzelman mine in Arivaca, Arizona. William Wrightson, who managed the local mining company and whose name graces Mount Wrightson in the Santa Cruz Mountain, was also followed by his brother John. Now, Mexican resentment was high against these new Americans. Resentment against the U.S. as a whole for taking Mexican land during the Gadsden Purchase was still an issue. The Anglos tended to deride and mistreat their Mexican workers. One mining supervisor had this to say: the Mexicans are afraid to trust their property on this side of the line, as the impression prevails that the Texans are all filibusters and robbers. Texan is another name for white people, okay? Now, the origin of the mistrust probably is illustrated in this account of a mining accident in 1861. 15 Mexican and Native American men were killed after being buried alive in the mine shaft when the roof caved in. The men were deep within the shaft, and it was just not considered feasible to attempt a rescue. That frightened the rest of the Mexican employees, who felt the mine would now be haunted, and so they all went home to Sonora. The Mexican workers, by the way, did occasionally get their vengeance, and Mr. Craig went down into one of the shafts, and the reporter noted that they beat his brains out with a stone hammer. Okay. To be fair, there were a lot of disreputable people of all races running around the area at that time, and they really didn't need much of an excuse to rob and kill. Now, Charles Poston, brother John, was killed by bandits at that mine over near Arivaca in 1861. 2 German employees were also murdered. Whether the bandits got much money or not is debatable. Legend, because there's always mining legend around this place, is that there is $30,000 still hidden on the hills right near the grave site. So if you want to go, it's there, okay? By the way, just so you know, people come into the mission on a regular basis into the national park and say, I know you guys know where it is and you're hiding it from us. Trust me, I would not be a lowly paid park ranger. All right. Now, William Wrightson's brother, John, has a more detailed, interesting, and bloody story. There's some suggestion that John was not the sharpest tack in the family tree. Upon arrival in Arizona, he was placed in charge of the livestock and the farms at the old mission of Tumacácori. The fields at the mission were still producing 30 years after the last priest left. Now, John had fired a couple of vaqueros. We have no information on why, but the following day he got a report that the horse herd at Tumacácori had wandered off. He saddled up alone and rode on the 4 miles down to Tumacácori. He failed to return that evening, and the next morning a search party was sent out after him. His body was found in the afternoon on a muggy, hot Sunday, August 14th, 1859, a little north and east of the Tumacácori church, 10 minutes from the church building. His body lay near the river amongst bunches of saccatone grass, which grew as high as a man. The searchers had to get within 6 feet of him before they found him, and they only found him because of the buzzing of flies. Now, John Wrightson had been murdered, and the money belt he always carried was taken. He'd been stabbed 3 times while on horseback, once on the left side above the navel, once on the collarbone, which fell into the neck, and once in the upper back, apparently as he plunged from his horse. Horace Grosvenor, a mine superintendent, wrote to John's brother, I cannot At this time, enter into particulars of the heart-rending view presented to me when I reached the spot. Your brother was slain foully, cowardly by more than one assassin. He had not time to struggle, but to all appearance died suddenly. 3 mortal wounds were in his body, lance wounds, apparently given while on horseback. And in case you thought nastiness and libeling the deceased is new to our times, the New Orleans Crescent slandered John without crediting any source. John, it said, was not fit to have charge of the Mexican peons, being intemperate, totally unacquainted with the Spanish language, and very overbearing. The Crescent wrote that his brother William was often warned that John would be killed sooner or later. Now, the newspaper was forced to retract their defamatory comments in a later edition. Whether those comments were valid, we don't know today. No locals reported or recorded that he was a jerk of any kind, so we're not really sure. Now, John was carried to Tubac, and he still lies buried next to St. Anne's Church. The current roadway on your right probably runs over his body daily now. So he has to endure car tires, So poor John, by the way, only had a $20 gold piece in his trunk, a few clothes, a letter to his wife, and that photograph that I showed you of John. Now, about $100 was offered for the capture of assassins. They were, of course, never caught. John's murder did leave historians with some interesting findings. John was stabbed to death with lances. Okay? That is quite remarkable information. Though we know Spaniards and Mexicans had both used lances, we did not know that the middle of the 19th century that the vaqueros were still using lances to herd cattle. So that was kind of a cool find. That information reinforces how strong the Spanish influence is in the Santa Cruz Valley. I should also mention, I showed a picture of sacatone grass that he was found in sacatone grass as high as a man, okay? The river used to be full of it. We have none around the mission anymore. Sacatone has been reduced to 5% of its original population. The park is actually trying to replant it and trying to get it going again, but we have a battle with Bermuda that was brought in. So, this slide, I wanted to mention that William Wrightson, who Mount Wrightson is named for, himself died in 1865 ambushed by Apaches. And now, it wasn't just human meanness that caused danger, even nature added to the grim toll in the valley. The June 9th, 1859 Weekly Arizonian reported a grizzly bear attack. Grizzlies are native to the mountains of southern Arizona. They are smaller than the big grizzlies up in Montana and Wyoming, but the Sonoran grizzly at about 700 pounds could be just as fierce. In 1859, the population of grizzlies had swollen due to abandoned Spanish and Mexican cattle running all over the countryside. All those cows Dan talked about in the Battle of the Bull. Now, the Arizonian article reported that a cinnamon bear attacked a couple of vaqueros at the base of the Santa Ritas. The cowboys were not armed. Didn't I tell you this place is weird? So the bear was probably surprised and immediately attacked one of the men who was on foot, biting him in the thigh and the arm. The second cowboy lassoed the bear. The bear released its grip on the victim and snapped the lasso with such force that the horse and man almost went down. Due to a large forest fire that engulfed much of the Santa Ritas that year, grizzly bear encounters became fairly common during that summer. 3 were seen right out back of Tubac, drinking from the river. Now, by the way, the last soaring grizzly bear in Arizona was killed in the 1930s. By the 1970s, all the bears were thought to have been killed off in Sonora, Mexico. But there's been some recent research, it's kind of cool, that offers the possibility that grizzly bears still exist high up in the Sierra Madres. ironically protected by the cartels that are growing marijuana at the base. Okay? Now, nature has also come to the valley in the form of flooding, causing some devastating floods. Floods in 1967 and 1977 were particularly bad. In December of 1967, flood water swept through the narrowest part of the valley, washing out the railroad tracks and roads. A number of houses were destroyed. Reports claim that the river actually backed up to the foothills of the Santa Rita Mountains. If you travel to Amado, Arizona today and get off on the east side of the freeway, you can still see the high water mark where it came up. You can see all these abandoned houses that are there. Trees were knocked down like bowling pins. One of the rangers I worked with actually grew up in the valley and said after the 1967 flood that you could walk from Rio Rico to Green Valley and never be in shade. That's how much damage was done. So, needless to say, there were still floods again that devastated everything in 1983 and 1991, but those were the ones. Even modern conveniences like cars and trains have added to the quirkiness of danger in the valley. February 2nd, 1930, a bizarre train accident near Tumacácori takes the life of Honorinda Wager. This death took a small part of a column in the Border Verdette newspaper. They did not even mention her name. She was Mrs. Wager in the newspaper. The poor woman was said to be a popular citizen of Nogales. Apparently her husband was driving and they were in a farm field looking at some latest tractor, and he climbed up the embankment next to the railroad in the car and stopped it. Well, they're watching the tractor plowing in the field and they're paying no attention to the tracks. The Tucson-bound train is coming north. It clips the car and drags it 50 feet. It never turns over, the car never turns over, and it finally comes to rest against the cattle guard. The car was large enough and the force hard enough, it tore the cow catcher off the front of the car, or off the front of the train. The automobile was reportedly totally demolished. Honorinda herself was trapped in the car with the upper part of her body hanging from the vehicle. Her back appeared to be breaking. They pronounced her dead right on the scene. In a mix of modern and old, a second accident occurred in Tubac in 1930 as well. A driver managed to hit a horse and a young Mexican boy riding that horse. The boy escaped serious injury, but the woman received a very bad cut in her eye, and they thought that she was going to lose the eye. She did not. The horse turned out to be the only fatality. A third driver, this time a woman, managed to roll her car over 3 times at Tubac. She escaped with only scratches and bruises. And I just want to remind you guys that we're talking about 1930. Cars are lucky if they can hit 45 miles an hour. They're on a dirt road and they're in the middle of nowhere, and they all managed to come into contact with something else. So, now, I circle back and leave you with Apaches and some heroic women. Now, as I told you, Apache attacks happen a lot less than we tend to believe. Apaches avoid confrontation if possible. Apaches have no warrior society. Nobody thinks it's cool to count coup. That's just silly. Apaches do pick off the lone herder and small groups of travelers, and mostly they sneak around and steal property. You actually get more kudos if you can run in and take everything you own and you never saw me. So, okay. Some of our stories of encounters with Apaches in times prior to the Civil War read better than a Hollywood script. The New York Herald reported a story from Arizona on February 21st, 1859, which provided courageous women in leading roles. An article detailed an Apache raid, probably Chiricahua Apaches based on the direction of travel. The Herald reported that the raiders hit Tubac and attempted to steal mules and horses from Tubac. Crossing the pass below Mount Wrightson, they hit a mine supply wagon. The driver escaped, but all the arms and provisions and livestock with the wagon were taken. The Apaches began to head east toward probably their home in the Chiricahua Mountains, and they overtook some travelers. The party they overtook included 2 discharged sergeants who had just served out their enlistment at Fort Buchanan. Their names were Ryan and Kelly. They were accompanied by their wives and 2 other unnamed men. The 2 sergeants were shot in the first fire. Ryan died instantly. Kelly was mortally wounded. One of the other men immediately beat feet and ran away back to Fort Buchanan, no doubt to get help. Okay. The newspaper said the other man and the 2 women heroically seized their husbands' revolvers and used them. They were so fierce the Apaches actually retreated. The bodies of Ryan and Kelly were brought back to Fort Buchanan. The report read, both the deceased soldiers were excellent men, and their sad fate calls forth many regrets from their late comrades. We have absolutely no idea what happened to the wives. Okay? So, I feel sorry for you men when I'm done here, okay? I finish with the story of Larsina Pennington Page, the most heroic of heroines and the most curious and strange of stories in southern Arizona. On March 16th, 1860, Larsina Pennington Page was kidnapped by Apaches. She's captured from a lumber camp in Madera Canyon on the Santa Rita Mountains. She's alone, except with a little girl, in the camp when it happens. The Apaches capture her, and Larsina is either dragging her feet or annoying her captors with constant talking. She did supposedly leave breadcrumbs of clothing as a trail to follow her. And they went north for a while, and the Apaches, tired of Larsina for whatever the reason was, they took her dress and her shoes. They lance her 11 times. She falls into an arroyo, and then just to make sure, they stone her. All right? She's left for dead in the snow, but she recovers enough to get going. Barefoot and almost naked, she crawls and stumbles 15 miles for 16 days. Finally makes it into the camp. She ate grass and luckily found snow to drink, that she could drink. At times, rescuers passed right by her, but she was too weak to yell out. The incredible woman managed to self-rescue herself. And legend has it, because she's a true Arizona pioneer, that the first thing she asked for was a plug of tobacco. Larsina would go on to become one of the most important pioneers of Tucson and one of our great heroines. Now, I often refer to the Penningtons, her family, as the Kennedys of southern Arizona, at least in the tragic way. The fate of her family does show how quirky death and danger can be. Of the 12 children, only 4 died of natural causes. 1 ended up insane, 1 committed suicide, 2 died of malaria, 2 were killed by Apaches, and 2 died of unknown causes. Their mother died of illness, and their father was also killed by Apaches. Larsina's own husband, not even a year after she almost gets killed, is killed by Apaches. As I said in the beginning, the Santa Cruz Valley is the bringer of all things weird and quirky, and lots of stories. The valley is absolutely full of these tales, and though often they are hard to believe, it does turn out that they're usually true. Thank you.